The sand hissed like fire, engines moaned, dying one by one under the African sun. 12 soldiers stared at the horizon. No water, no movement, just heat that bent the air. And then, a sound. A bucket scraping metal. Private Evans laughed. "What's he doing?" "Making tea for the tanks." But Engineer Hargreaves didn't answer. He was too busy filling old ammunition tins with sand, water, and hope. They laughed at his bucket cooling trick. 6 hours later, those same buckets were the only reason any of them were still breathing. North Africa. 1942, British 8th Army convoy. The desert had gone silent. Not peaceful, dead silent. Even the wind had stopped. The kind of silence that pressed on your skull until you started to hear your own heartbeat. Private Miller said later he could feel his skin crisping like paper. The temperature had passed 50 degrees, but the gauges had already given up trying to measure. By midday, the men stopped talking. Their lips cracked. Their throats ached from swallowing dust instead of air. The smell of burnt fuel, hot steel, and sweat clung to everything. Uniforms, sand, even breath. 12 soldiers and 5 vehicles stood marooned in the endless gold of the Libyan desert, 30 miles from the nearest supply post. Corporal Hayes kicked at the radiator of his truck and cursed. "Bloody desert's got a mouth," he said, voice hoarse. "It just eats everything, and in a way it did. Every hour something else disappeared. Fuel, rations, patience, even laughter, once their only defense was gone." At the edge of the group sat Engineer William Hargreaves, his back against the dead hull of a Bedford truck, eyes half shut behind cracked goggles. He was a strange one, the kind of man who talked to machines like they were alive. While others smoked or cursed, he scribbled numbers into a grease-stained notebook. Pressure, airflow, condensation, his private religion. "Will," Hayes muttered, "you trying to pray that heap back to life?" Will looked up, blinking slowly. "Math's closer to prayer than you think." The others laughed, a thin, dry sound. By now their engines had become ovens. The heat warped metal, and even touching a steering column could blister the skin. The water they carried had boiled inside its canisters. A few tried drinking anyway. It tasted like rust and death. When the officer in charge, Lieutenant Brooks, gathered the men, he didn't sugarcoat it. "Headquarters doesn't even know we're out here. If we can't move by morning, we walk at dawn." No one argued. No one could. But that night, as the horizon bled red and purple, Will sat awake beside a row of dented buckets, the kind they used for oil, now empty. He stared at the cooling engines, at the steam twisting from the vents like breath from dying lungs. He murmured to himself, "If it can breathe, it can live." The desert answered only with wind. When morning came, 2 trucks had already seized completely. The sand was too hot to touch. Brooks gave the order, "We start walking in 1 hour." No one noticed that Will didn't move. He was kneeling beside an engine, building something strange. Metal cans, torn shirts, bits of wire, and those empty buckets filled halfway with sand and water from his own ration flask. Hayes frowned. "What in God's name are you doing?" Will didn't look up. "Saving what's left of us." The others laughed again, short, bitter. But that day, something changed. And none of them would ever laugh again. The next morning, the desert looked the same. Endless, golden, merciless. But inside that stillness, something small had changed. Private Evans was the first to notice. He was leaning over the nearest engine, swearing softly, when his hand brushed against one of Will's buckets. He jerked back. "Cold," he whispered. "Bloody hell, it's cold." At first, no one believed him. The air was hot enough to cook rations, and their boots sank into sand that shimmered like molten glass. But there it was, a faint chill, like breath drawn from a cave. Will sat nearby, eyes hollow with exhaustion. He hadn't slept. He'd been moving buckets through the night, adjusting rags, twisting bits of wire, dripping what little water he had left. Around him, small patches of damp sand had darkened like islands in the ocean of light. Lieutenant Brooks frowned. "Explain, engineer." Will took a slow breath. "Evaporative cooling. When the wind moves through wet cloth, it draws heat away. The buckets trap the airflow. The engines will live a few more hours. Brooks squinted. Hours won't get us home. Will didn't argue. He just whispered, "Sometimes an hour is enough." The men didn't understand the science, but they understood survival. They began to help him. Grudgingly, at first. They tore pieces of their uniforms into strips, dipped them into the last of the water, and wrapped them around the buckets. The desert wind hissed across the wet cloth, carrying a strange, impossible sensation. Coolness. For a few hours they forgot to complain. At dusk, one of the soldiers started humming, an old English tune from home, something about rain. Soon another joined in. Their voices were cracked, broken, but the sound floated across the empty horizon like defiance. Will didn't sing. He just watched the engines, his lips moving silently. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with rough sketches and equations that looked like madness to anyone else. Inside his head, numbers clicked into place. Pressure ratios, surface area, vapor diffusion. To him, it wasn't math anymore. It was mercy. When night fell, the desert cooled sharply. The men gathered around the faintly humming trucks, and for the first time in days, the engines didn't cough or spit. They were breathing again. Evans grinned through cracked lips. "Maybe the old bastard's onto something." Hayes smirked. "Next, he'll build us an air conditioner out of sand." Will gave a faint smile. "You'd be surprised what sand can do when you stop fighting it." The laughter that followed was small but real. Tired. Human. Alive. Later, when the others slept, Will sat alone beside the line of buckets, tracing the condensation forming along their rims. Tiny drops of water, born out of the very air that had tried to kill them. He held one droplet between his fingers, trembling. "If this can happen here," he whispered, "then maybe hope isn't gone." The horizon glowed faintly. Not sunrise, but something else. A faint orange shimmer. Smoke, or maybe fire. He stared at it for a long time before whispering, "The desert's changing. It's not done with us yet." By dawn, the buckets were half empty, but the engines still breathed. The convoy had survived the night. Barely. Lieutenant Brooks paced between the vehicles, his uniform stained with sweat and sand. "Supplies are gone," he muttered. "We've got half a can of water left, fuel leaking, and no sign of command." He turned to Will. "Your trick bought us time. But time doesn't drive engines." Will didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the smoke he'd seen last night had grown thicker, curling upward like a warning. Private Evans coughed violently, his lips blue. The others watched in silence. Even hope felt heavy now. When the sun rose again, it did so with cruelty. The sand turned white, blinding. The air itself shimmered, bending the line between sky and ground until everything looked like a lie. Hayes threw his canteen into the dust. "We're walking in circles. These machines are done." Will's voice cracked as he replied, "They're not done. They're tired." He knelt beside the nearest truck, pressing his palm against the hot metal as though it could feel him. Brooks stared. "Are you saying you can fix this?" "With buckets and cloth." Will didn't look up. "With patience." His hands moved automatically, tightening bolts, wiping down vents, checking for pressure leaks. But inside he was collapsing. Every calculation he'd written blurred with sweat. Every drop of water felt like blood lost. Then, suddenly, a sound. A faint pop followed by a hiss. One of the cooling rigs burst, the soaked rag igniting like paper. The men scrambled, stomping out the flame with their boots. The smell of burnt cloth filled the air. Evans shouted, "That's it, we're finished." Will froze, trembling. He saw the fire, the fear, the hopelessness in their eyes, and something broke in him. He turned away from the wreckage and stared into the distance. "Give me 1 hour," he said quietly. "Just one," Brooks shook his head. "You've already had your hour." But Will was already walking into the storm. The wind whipped around him, carrying sand that cut into his face like glass. He stumbled, clutching a torn water skin and a handful of rags. Somewhere in that blinding chaos he started digging. Not for water, for airflow. He'd remembered something. A fragment from years ago. A summer afternoon in Yorkshire. His father bent over a broken tractor, sweat rolling down his neck. The old man had smiled and said, "It's not the heat that kills, lad. It's giving up." That memory clung to him now like a prayer. He built makeshift vapor traps using tin lids and rope, channeling the air through soaked rags. He didn't know if it would work, only that it had to. When he returned to camp hours later, the men were slumped in the shade of their trucks, eyes half closed. He set down his gear silently, hands shaking. "This time," he whispered, "we don't fight the desert. We make it work for us." And for the first time, no one laughed. The sky had turned white by mid-morning, a colorless dome of light pressing down on everything. The men sat in silence, their helmets too hot to touch, their minds already halfway gone. Then a sound broke through the quiet, a low rumble, soft but alive. Will stood beside one of the trucks, his hands trembling on the starter crank. His new system looked insane. Buckets half buried in the sand, water dripping through strips of cloth into tin channels that led to the engine vents. The air above shimmered with heat, yet a faint mist rose from the setup. The men gathered around, shielding their eyes. Evans muttered, "He's finally lost it." But the engine coughed, once, twice, then roared to life. No one spoke. They just stared. The impossible had happened. In a place where even breath burned, a machine was breathing cold air. Will leaned his forehead against the metal, whispering, "Easy, girl. You're free now." The sound of the engine spread through the camp like a pulse. It wasn't just machinery. It was the sound of hope. Lieutenant Brooks blinked hard, his voice almost breaking. "Bloody miracle." Will turned to him. "Not a miracle, sir. Just physics that remembers mercy." The men rushed to copy his setup, digging pits, soaking cloth, trading whatever drops of water they could spare. Within an hour, 3 engines rumbled weakly, shaking off the silence that had felt like death. They weren't moving yet, but they could, and that was enough to make them believe again. Evans laughed through cracked lips. "Buckets, lads. We're going home with buckets." Even Brooks smiled, just for a moment. That night, the men sat around the revived engines, their faces glowing orange under the flicker of flame. The desert, for once, didn't feel like an enemy. Will sat apart, staring at his hands, blistered, bleeding, covered in grease. He wasn't thinking about glory, just the strange stillness between heartbeats, the kind that comes when the impossible finally works. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. The engines lived. The men did not yet, and tomorrow the desert would test them again. They left at dawn. The convoy crawled across the dunes, slow as a wounded beast. Each engine wore its bucket crown, dripping and steaming in the morning haze. The air smelled like wet sand, strange, foreign, almost sweet. Every half hour, the men stopped to refill the rags and check the water levels. The buckets had become their lifeline, and their curse. For every drop poured into a cooling tin, one less for a throat. Hayes walked beside the truck, muttering, "We're drinking our bloody engines now." Evans replied, "A fair trade if it gets us home." For a time, hope held. They sang again, quietly, hoarse voices cracking on each note. But by midday, the wind turned vicious. A sirocco swept across the dunes, choking everything in red dust. Visibility dropped to nothing. The convoy lurched, stalled, then stopped. Will shouted above the wind, "Keep the vents covered! Don't let sand in!" But his voice was lost in the storm. When the air cleared, an hour later, one truck was gone, swallowed by the desert. Only a torn piece of tarp fluttered in the wind. The silence after was heavier than grief. Evans sank to his knees, whispering, "It was McNeil. He was just behind me." No one answered. Will stared at the horizon, empty again, endless again, and felt something collapse inside him. He'd built systems to save machines, not men, and now a man was gone because of him. That night, as they camped under a bruised purple sky, Will sat alone by the dying fire. He could hear the engines ticking softly, alive, loyal. But every sound reminded him of McNeil's voice, fading into the wind. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Machines can be rebuilt. Men cannot." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But maybe one can save the other." When dawn came, Brooks placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't carry ghosts, Will. Just get us out of here." Will nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where faint smoke lines rose once more. Was it rescue? Or another trial waiting? The desert never answered. It only waited, patient, merciless, and alive. By the third day, the desert had stripped them of everything human. Laughter, fear, even the will to dream. Only survival remained, and even that was fraying at the edges. The convoy limped through an ocean of heat, engines coughing but alive, thanks to the buckets that sloshed weakly with what little moisture they still held. The men looked like ghosts now, wrapped in ragged cloth to shield from the burning wind. Will hadn't slept in almost 2 days. His lips were cracked to bleeding. His hands, once steady as instruments, now shook with every gear he turned. But his mind refused to quit. Each mile became a war in itself. Fuel ran low first. Then, one by one, the buckets began to dry. The condensation traps no longer formed water overnight. The air itself had turned too dry to give. The desert had found a new way to kill them. Lieutenant Brooks gathered the men. "We've got 1 shot left. If we can make it to the ridge by sunset, there should be an old fuel post beyond it. German or British, I don't care. We'll take it." Evans looked up at the sun, weakly. "And if we don't?" Brooks didn't answer. They pressed on. The engines groaned louder than before, each sound like a plea for mercy. By midday, the lead truck shuddered, sputtered, and died. The men scrambled to check the engine, but Will already knew. He knelt beside it, touching the side of the bucket. Bone dry. He stared into it, into emptiness. Then he looked at the others. Their faces were gray, hollow, eyes sunken. He took off his canteen, unscrewed it, and poured the last of his water into the bucket. Not a drop hesitated. "Engineer!" Brooks barked. "That's your drinking water." Will didn't look up. "It's all the same now. Whether it goes into me or into her," he said, patting the truck. "It either keeps something alive or nothing at all." The engine coughed once, then again, and it started. For a brief, beautiful second, there was sound. Life. Motion. The convoy moved again, but the heat was relentless, and Will could feel the world blurring. By late afternoon, the horizon began to melt. The ridge they'd been chasing looked no closer than before. The men were silent, walking beside the moving trucks like shadows. Then came the worst. One of the cooling rigs burst from heat pressure. A thin hiss, then a violent crack. Steam and sand exploded outward. The bucket's rim glowed red. Will ran. "Get back!" he shouted. He didn't wait. He dropped to his knees, hands burning as he yanked free the wire connecting the line. The pressure was too high. He knew it. He'd miscalculated. Brooks yelled, "Leave it! It's going to blow!" But Will didn't move. He looked up at the men, the last 11 soldiers alive, and smiled. "If you make it," he said quietly, "tell them it wasn't the bucket. It was the will." A flash. Then sound. A shockwave rolled through the sand, knocking men to the ground. Fire lit the horizon for a moment, a fleeting sunset born from man's defiance. When the smoke cleared, the truck still stood. Half the cooling rig was gone, but the engine roared steady, and where Will had been, there was only scorched sand and the twisted shape of a melted wrench. No one spoke. Not for a long time. As the convoy crawled forward again, Evans whispered. He stayed behind so the rest could move. Brooks didn't answer. He just looked at the single remaining bucket swaying from the last truck's side, dented, blackened, but still dripping water. The sun dipped behind the ridge. For the first time in 3 days, the air cooled. 12 soldiers had set out. 11 kept moving. But they all carried one man's heat in their hearts, and his trick that had become legend. The morning after the explosion, the desert was unnaturally still. The wind had died, leaving only silence, a silence that felt sacred. 11 men stood where 12 had fought to survive. The sun rose pale and heavy, casting long shadows over the sand. The convoy moved again, slow but alive. Engines that should have died days ago still rumbled, cooled by the last of Will's strange improvised buckets. The men didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Every clank of metal and hiss of steam felt like his voice echoing through the desert. By midday, the ridge appeared, the one Will had sworn led to safety. The climb was brutal, the sand soft and endless, but they pushed on, driven by something deeper than orders. When they reached the top, the sight below stopped them cold. A small valley, rusted tanks, a few crumbling sheds, and in the center a fuel post. Old, half-buried, but unmistakably British. Evans laughed first, a dry, broken laugh that turned into a sob. He was right. The mad bastard was right. The men stumbled forward, tripping over themselves in disbelief. Inside the wreckage they found cracked barrels, twisted metal, and one small water tank still sealed tight. When they pried it open, the scent of cool metal and clean air hit them like a miracle. Brooks filled his canteen and took a slow sip, staring into the horizon. "He bought this for us," he murmured. "Every mile, every drop." That night, the 11 of them sat around a small fire. No one spoke of war or home or medals. They spoke only of Will, the quiet man who'd built life out of scraps, who'd made the desert breathe. Evans took a small melted wrench from his pocket, what was left of Will's last tool. He placed it in the sand beside the fire. "Leave it here," he said softly. He earned his rest. When dawn broke, they buried the wrench at the base of the ridge. No grand marker, no cross, just a small piece of metal with words carved into it using a knife. W. Hargreaves. Made it work,